deep in the canyon country of the Southwest, where the Colorado River carves its way through the red rock of the high desert on the border between Utah and Arizona, stands a great curved wall of concrete that holds back one of the largest reservoirs in the United States. It is Glen Canyon Dam, and the vast body of water it impounds is Lake Powell, the second largest reservoir in the country, a sprawling maze of flooded canyons that has, for generations, both stored the water of the upper Colorado River and generated a river of electricity for the West. Now imagine the day after a threshold is finally crossed, a day the region has feared for years. The day the water in Lake Powell falls so low that it can no longer turn the great turbines within Glen Canyon Dam, and the electricity that has flowed from the dam for nearly a century ceases. This is not the death of the reservoir, not the end of the dam, not the failure of the water supply, but it is a milestone of enormous significance, a dark warning about the crisis gripping the Colorado River, and a sign of how close the great system has come to the edge. This is the story of what happens the day after Lake Powell stops making power, of what the silence means, and of the dangers it reveals. To understand the significance of this moment, you first have to understand the role that Lake Powell and Glen Canyon Dam play in the great system of the Colorado River, because it is a role different from that of its more famous downstream twin. The Colorado River is divided into an upper basin and a lower basin, and Lake Powell sits at the pivot point between them, the great reservoir of the upper basin, storing the water that flows down from the mountains of the upper region before releasing it downstream to Lake Mead in the lower basin below. Glen Canyon Dam, which holds back Lake Powell, serves several vital functions at once. It stores the water of the upper Colorado, banking it in wet years to release in dry ones. It allows the upper basin to meet its obligation to the lower basin, releasing it through the dam toward Lake Mead. And it generates electricity, its turbines producing power as the water falls through the dam, a major source of hydroelectric energy for the West. Lake Powell is in this sense the great keystone of the upper basin, as Lake Mead is the keystone of the lower, and together they form the twin pillars of the entire Colorado River system. The generation of power at Glen Canyon Dam, like that at Hoover Dam downstream, depends on the level of the reservoir, and this is the heart of the matter. The dam produces electricity by allowing water to fall from Lake Powell through intakes and down through the turbines, and this only works as long as the water in the reservoir stays above the level of those intakes. As Lake Powell has fallen, driven down by the long drought and the chronic overuse of the river, it has approached the level at which the water drops too low to drive the turbines effectively. The level known as minimum power pool. The day Lake Powell stops making power is the day the reservoir falls to that critical level, the day the water drops too low to turn the turbines, and the generators of Glen Canyon Dam fall silent. And here's a crucial point that makes the situation at Glen Canyon particularly precarious, a point that distinguishes it in an important way from the situation downstream. Below the level of minimum power pool, there is a further and more dangerous concern about how water can even be released from the dam at all. This is one of the most important and least understood aspects of the crisis at Lake Powell, and it deserves careful explanation. Glen Canyon Dam was designed to release water primarily through its power plant, through the turbines that generate electricity as the water passes through. But when the reservoir falls below the level of minimum power pool, the water can no longer pass through the turbines, and it must instead be released through a different and smaller set of outlets, the bypass tubes or river outlet works, which sit lower in the dam. These bypass outlets were designed for occasional use, not for the sustained release of the large volumes of water that must flow downstream to meet the upper basin's obligations to the lower basin. There are real questions about whether these smaller outlets can handle the sustained high-volume releases that would be required if the reservoir fell below minimum power pool for an extended period, and concerns about the wear and the strain that such prolonged use might place on outlets that were never intended for it. This is a distinctive danger at Glen Canyon Dam. The worry that below the level at which power can be generated, the very ability to release water downstream in the necessary quantities could be compromised, threatening the delivery of water to the entire lower basin. So what actually happens on the day after Lake Powell stops making power? The first and most immediate consequence is the loss of the electricity itself, and this is a significant blow to the power supply of a wide region. The power generated by Glen Canyon Dam feeds the grid across a large portion of the West, supplying electricity to utilities and communities across multiple states, and its loss removes a meaningful source of generation from the regional supply. As with the loss of power at Hoover Dam, this does not mean that the lights immediately go out across the region, because the electrical grid is a vast and interconnected system, and the power from Glen Canyon Dam, significant as it is, represents a portion of the total supply that can, at least in the near term, be made up from other sources. The utilities that depended on the dam's power would have to find that electricity elsewhere, buying it from other generators, straining the system and raising costs, but they would not, on the first day, be plunged into darkness. The grid has redundancy and flexibility, and the loss of one source, even a large one, can be absorbed, at least for a time, by the rest of the system. But the loss of Glen Canyon Dam's power would be far from trivial, for it would carry real and painful consequences. The electricity from the dam has been a source of clean, renewable, and relatively inexpensive power, and its loss would force the region to replace it with electricity from other sources, potentially more expensive, and depending on the source, more polluting. The cost of this replacement power would be passed on to the utilities and their customers, raising electricity bills across a wide region. And critically, the power from Glen Canyon Dam has traditionally been allocated in large part to public entities, to municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives, and tribal nations across a broad swath of the West, for whom this power has been a crucial and affordable resource. For these smaller and often less wealthy communities, many of them rural, many of them serving populations with limited means, the loss of the dam's affordable power would be a serious blow, forcing them to buy replacement electricity at potentially much higher prices, straining their budgets and raising costs for their residents. The revenue from the sale of the dam's power has also funded important programs, including environmental and infrastructure programs across the basin, so its loss would ripple outward in ways that reach beyond the electricity itself. Beyond the immediate loss of electricity, the day after Lake Powell stops making power would carry a deeper and more ominous significance, one that goes to the very heart of the Colorado River crisis. The silence of the turbines at Glen Canyon Dam would be a stark and undeniable signal that the reservoir had fallen to a critically low level, that the crisis of the river had reached a dangerous new stage. And because of the peculiar danger of the bypass outlets, the loss of power at Lake Powell would carry an even more alarming warning than the equivalent event downstream, because it would mean the reservoir had fallen to within reach of the level at which the ability to release water downstream itself could be compromised. If Lake Powell fell below minimum power pool and had to rely on the smaller bypass outlets to release water, and if those outlets could not sustain the necessary volumes, then the upper basin's ability to deliver water downstream to Lake Mead and the lower basin could be threatened, a catastrophe that would ripple through the entire system. The day Lake Powell stops making power would be a sign that the system was approaching this dangerous territory, a warning of a threat not just to the power, but to the fundamental function of delivering water through the dam. This threat to the delivery of water is what makes the situation at Lake Powell so uniquely alarming, and it reveals the interconnection of the two great reservoirs, Lake Mead. Downstream depends on the water released from Lake Powell, water that flows down through Glen Canyon Dam and on toward the lower basin. If Lake Powell fell so low that it could not reliably release water downstream, then Lake Mead would be starved of its inflow, accelerating its own decline toward the critical levels that threaten the lower basin. The two reservoirs are linked, the upstream bank and the downstream bank of a single system, and the failure of the upstream reservoir to release water would threaten the downstream reservoir as well. The day Lake Powell stops making power would thus be a warning not just for the upper basin, but for the entire system, a sign that the upstream keystone was faltering in a way that could bring down the whole structure, threatening the water supply of tens of millions of people across the basin. This is the deeper meaning of the silence of the turbines at Glen Canyon Dam, a warning that reaches far beyond the loss of electricity to the very heart of the West's water. The response to the crossing of this threshold would have to be swift and serious, for the day after Lake Powell stopped making power would demand urgent action to prevent the slide toward even more catastrophic levels. The states of the basin, the federal government, the water managers, and the political leaders would face enormous pressure to reduce the use of the river, to release water from reservoirs even further upstream, to prop up the level of Lake Powell, to do whatever could be done to keep the reservoir from falling below the levels at which water delivery could be compromised. In the crisis of recent years, water has already been released from upstream reservoirs to prop up Lake Powell, and the dam's operations have been adjusted to try to preserve its ability to generate power and release water. Emergency measures taken to keep the reservoir above the most dangerous levels. The crossing of the minimum power pool threshold would intensify these efforts, forcing the region into a scramble to stabilize the reservoir and preserve its essential functions. A crisis that could galvanize action in a way that years of warnings had failed to do. The loss of power, terrible as it would be, could serve as a shock that jolts the region into the drastic measures needed to prevent the worst catastrophe of a reservoir unable to deliver its water. It is worth understanding, too, how the loss of Glen Canyon's generation would interact with the peculiar timing of the region's power needs. Because the timing compounds the danger. The demand for electricity across the West rises sharply in summer, when air conditioning runs around the clock in the extreme heat. And it is precisely in the hot, dry conditions of a prolonged drought that the reservoir is most stressed and the risk of falling to minimum power pool is greatest. This means the loss of the dam's power could come just when the region needs electricity most, straining a grid already pushed toward its limits by the demands of cooling a growing population in the heat. The power from Glen Canyon is also a flexible, dispatchable source that can be ramped up quickly to meet peaks in demand, and its loss would remove not just a quantity of electricity, but a particularly useful kind of it, one that helps hold the whole system together at the moments of greatest stress. It is worth pausing to consider the human dimension of this moment, the way that the loss of Lake Powell's power would touch the lives of ordinary people across a wide region. There would be the rising electricity bills, as utilities passed on the cost of replacement power to their customers, adding to the burdens of families already stretched thin and falling especially hard on the rural communities and tribal nations that have depended on the dam's affordable power. There would be the anxiety and the fear, as people came to understand the significance of what had happened, as the news spread that the great dam had fallen silent and that the reservoir had reached a level once thought unthinkable. There would be the concern for the water supply itself, the dawning realization that the silence of the turbines was a warning of a threat to the delivery of water on which the entire lower basin depends. And there would be, above all, the growing awareness that the water and the power that the region had always taken for granted were not guaranteed, that the foundation of life in the arid West was more fragile than anyone had wanted to believe. The day after would be a day of unease and awakening, a day when the abstract crisis became personal and immediate for millions of people. There is a broader lesson in the scenario of Lake Powell stopping its power, one that speaks to the interconnection of water and energy and to the vulnerability of a system pushed to its limits. Glen Canyon Dam, like Hoover Dam downstream, was built to do many things at once, to store water and generate power and enable the delivery of water through the basin, and this multiplicity made it enormously valuable. But it also concentrated the region's dependence, so that the decline of the reservoir threatens not one thing but many at the same time. The loss of power at Lake Powell is a vivid illustration of this, because it shows how the water crisis and the energy supply are bound together, and how the falling of the reservoir threatens the power, the water delivery, and the whole system all at once. And the particular danger of the bypass outlets reveals how the great dams, for all their engineering might, were designed for a world of abundant water, a world in which the reservoirs would stay high and the water would flow through the turbines as intended, and how the arrival of a drier world has pushed them into territory their designers never fully anticipated, raising questions about their ability to function as the reservoirs fall to levels once thought impossible. The scenario also reveals the deeper truth that the region has built its life on a resource that is finite and declining, and that the day the dam stops making power would be a manifestation of the fundamental imbalance at the heart of the crisis. Lake Powell falls because more water is taken from the Colorado River than the river provides, a structural deficit that has been building for decades, hidden by the reserves in the great reservoirs, until those reserves began to run out. The loss of power is one of the consequences of that imbalance made visible, a sign that the reserves have fallen so low that the dam can no longer perform one of its essential functions, and may soon struggle to perform another. And it is a warning that the imbalance cannot be ignored forever, that the taking of more water than the river provides will eventually catch up with the region, in the loss of power, and if the decline continues, in the threat to the delivery of the water itself. The day after Lake Powell stops making power would be a day when the consequences of the imbalance could no longer be denied, a day of reckoning with the arithmetic of a river that has been asked to give more than it has. So what happens the day after Lake Powell stops making power? The turbines of Glen Canyon Dam fall silent, and the electricity that has flowed from them for the better part of a century ceases, forcing a wide region to find its power elsewhere, straining the grid, raising costs, and falling hardest on the rural communities and tribal nations that have depended on the dam's affordable electricity. The lights do not immediately go out, for the grid can absorb the loss for a time, but the blow is real and the consequences are serious. And beyond the practical consequences, the day after carries a profound and ominous significance. For the silence of the turbines is a warning that the reservoir has fallen to a critically low level, that the crisis has reached a dangerous new stage, and that the reservoir is approaching the territory in which its very ability to release water downstream could be compromised, threatening the water supply of the entire lower basin. The day after would be a day of emergency response, of scrambling to prevent the further decline of the reservoir and to preserve its essential functions, of confronting at last the reality that the region could no longer avoid. The scenario of Lake Powell stopping its power is not a certainty, and it is important to hold it in the right perspective, for the region is fighting hard to prevent the reservoir from falling to the critical levels through emergency cuts and negotiations and the release of water from upstream. And a few better winters have offered some reprieve from the most immediate danger. The day the dam stops making power may never come, if the region succeeds in stabilizing the reservoir and bringing its use of the river into balance with what the river provides. But the possibility is real, and it has been genuinely and urgently contemplated, for Lake Powell has fallen to within a not-so-distant margin of the minimum power pool level, close enough that the danger has been the subject of serious concern and emergency actions. The scenario is a warning, a glimpse of a threshold that the region has come frighteningly close to crossing, and understanding what would happen the day after is a way of appreciating the stakes and the urgency of the crisis, a way of grasping just how much depends on the level of a single reservoir in the canyon country of the Southwest. In the end, the day after Lake Powell stops making power would be a day that the American West has spent years trying to avoid, a day when a threshold long dreaded is finally crossed, when the great turbines of Glen Canyon Dam fall silent for the first time in the better part of a century. It would be a day of practical consequences, of lost electricity and rising costs and strained grids, and a day of deeper significance, of a warning sounded in the silence of the machines, of a reckoning with the fragility of a system built to tame a river that is now running dry. It would be a milestone on a dangerous road, a sign that the reservoir had fallen to a level once thought impossible and was approaching the territory in which the delivery of water itself could be threatened. And it would be, above all, a call to action, a shock that could galvanize the region to do at last the hard work of living within the means of its water, before the silence of the turbines gives way to a far greater crisis: the failure of the upstream reservoir to deliver the water on which the entire basin depends. The day after Lake Powell stops making power would be a day of warning, and whether the region heeds that warning, whether it acts in time to pull the reservoir back from the edge, would determine whether the loss of power remains a milestone survived or becomes the prelude to a catastrophe that engulfs the whole